What's up guys, it's Brad from LightArchitect here. In this video I'm going to be showing how to create this shot where this whale jumps out of the water and creates this splash using a fluid simulation in Mantaflow. I'll be going through how to bake your fluid simulations in Mantaflow, create a water mesh from that simulation, and then finally adding some foam and spray particles using Mantaflow as well to get the final result. Finally, in the second part of the tutorial, I'll also show how we can composite our fluid simulation into our live action shot. Anyways guys, let's get started. Here we are inside of Blender. I've deleted our default cube here and imported this whale 3D model from BlendSwap, and I'll put a link to this model in the description below, but it's a pretty nice model. We have a nice rig on it, but feel free to use any 3D asset of your choice for the animation. The first thing I'm going to do is add a camera to our scene and then load in our background footage. So I'll go ahead and press Shift A. I'll add a camera and I'll just drag this back here and view through it really quick, and I'll just kind of align it to the environment a bit better here. And now let's upload our footage that we're going to add our fluid simulation to. So I'll just go here to our camera tab and go to our background images and check the checkbox, and then we'll click add image, and we'll use a movie clip and open one here. And obviously you can use any movie clip of your choice, but I'll be using this one right here. So I'll go ahead and open that. And as you can see, it's just our background for our shot. And if we play through our shot, you'll notice that it is a locked off tripod shot, so we don't actually need to 3D track our camera. However, if you do have a moving shot, I have a tutorial on how to 3D track your footage and add CG elements to them as well. So I'll put a link to that in the description below. But anyways, I'll go ahead and just line up our CG camera to the general perspective of our live action shot here. Something like this should be pretty good. You can see our grid fairly nicely here, and we can adjust this later as well. Actually might pull this back a bit so our whale can stay at the center of our scene and we can animate from there. So I'll just kind of eyeball it here for now. And now it's time to animate our whale here. So in order to animate our whale effectively, I want to actually just kind of create a reference for the surface of our water here instead of just our grid in our 3D scene. So I'll go ahead and press Shift A. I'll add a plane and I'll just scale up our plane here like so. And I might actually just scale down our whale just because our scale is a little bit large here. So something like this should be pretty good. And I'll place our whale below our plane here. And now let's start to animate the main part of our whale here. So I'll go to frame 1. I'll just kind of rotate this and place it below our surface. And while this animation bone is selected, I'll press I and add a new location, rotation, and scale keyframe. Now that we've added our first keyframe, I'll go around frame maybe 24 and just go straight up, rotate it a little bit, press I, add a new location, rotation, and scale keyframe, and let's see what we have so far. Something like this. I might bring it down a tiny bit here, like this, and I might also just rotate it a slight bit as well. Alright, something like that. And then I'll go to frame maybe 44 and animate it coming down into the water here. Rotate it a little bit more. Press I, add another location, rotation, and scale keyframe, and let's see what this does for us. Alright, so, you know, pretty basic right now. I might actually rotate this part a little over. So just kind of play around with your settings here a bit. I'm not liking how our tail hits the water first, so I might adjust that a bit. I might just rotate this up. I'm not going to spend a lot of time with the animation here, just because this is more of a fluid simulation tutorial. Alright, so let's try this. So we have this kind of basic animation here. And it's not perfect, but this should work for the fluid simulation part of our tutorial. I might adjust a few of these other bones here to give it a little bit more organic result. So maybe adjust this one a bit. So start with this one over here, location, rotation, scale, and then we'll just animate it kind of coming up here and then back down, just to give it a little bit more of a unique look. And I might also do this back fin. So I'm just going to start adding some keyframes to give it a little bit more organic look, animating the fins around a little bit so that it's not so, you know, static or whatever. I might animate these fins as well. So again, I'm just doing the same thing here, adding those location, rotation, and scale keyframes, and just kind of dragging everything around a bit. Let's see what that looks like. And as you can see, I think that animating this fin here actually helped it quite a bit. So I'll animate the other one as well. So for the sake of this tutorial, I'm going to leave this animation as is, but feel free to tweak your animation further. Obviously this is not perfect, but we're going to continue with it. So we got about 2 seconds for the whale to come out of the water and then back in, which I think will look pretty nice. So now it's time to actually create our fluid simulation. So before we actually add our fluid flow object and domain cube for our simulation to reside within, I want to actually select the body of our whale here, and then under the physics properties tab, I'm going to add it as a fluid active object. And then for the type, I'm going to make this an effector and then make sure the effector type is collision. And by doing this, whenever we add our flow object and domain, this whale will actually interact with that flow object and create that splash. So now that we have done this, I'm going to go ahead and press Shift A, and I'll add a basic cube to our scene and scale this up to create our domain for the simulation. And the domain is essentially where your simulation resides within. So you want this as small as possible while containing the simulation. So you'll see here when we bake out the simulation that we don't want it so small that the edges are seen, but the bigger you make this, the more data you're going to need to get the same amount of detail. So we want to just have this just big enough to create our simulation within. So I might just scale it down a little bit. All right. So that's not bad for our domain. Now we're going to add a flow object to be the water inside of our domain. So instead of adding a new cube, what I want to do is I want to duplicate this cube that we've added as our domain and then place it to where the water level is, where our ocean plane reference is here. So what I'm going to do is I'll press Shift D, I'll duplicate our cube here, and then I'll just scale it down on the Z axis and scale it down a little bit more as well, just slightly, so it's slightly smaller than our domain cube, or what we're going to use as our domain cube. And then I'll just bring this down so that it's the general water level here, and just position it so that the bottom portion is right at the bottom of our domain cube, and then the top is right where our plane is. Now what we want to do is we want to make this cube a flow object for our simulation, and we want to make this larger cube a domain object. So to do that, I'll select our larger cube first, and I'll actually go ahead and relabel it here in our top right here. I'll call it domain cube, and then I'll select our second one here and we'll call this flow cube. So I'll select our domain cube here, and now let's go to our physics properties tab and click on fluid, and we want to change this type to domain. And now this cube is a domain cube where we can simulate our fluids within. Now let's go ahead and click our flow cube, go ahead and do the same thing, add it as a fluid, and then change the type to flow. And we don't want the flow type to be smoke, we want it to be liquid, and we'll leave it as geometry. And yeah, I think this should be pretty good. Now let's select our domain cube once more. We'll change the domain type to liquid. I'm going to actually bring down our time scale here for a little bit larger scale result. So I might just bring this down to say something below 1, maybe 0.4. I might increase the time steps minimum to something a little bit higher than 1 to give a little bit more detail in our simulation, maybe 2. I'll scroll down here. We want to keep the simulation method as flip, and for cache, see here, we want replay on, and we actually want to choose a place to save our cache data for our fluid simulation. So I'll bake around 100 frames for our simulation. So I'll change this end frame to 100. And then I'll click on this folder file and choose where to save our simulation data. So actually before I do that, I want to just save our project. So I'll just go ahead and file, save as, and I'll just call this water simulation tutorial. Okay, save it. And now I'll go to our cache tab here and create a folder to save our data. And we'll just call it water sim tutorial cache. And accept, and great. Now if we go to the beginning of our scene, as you can see, we're going to get all these dots at the surface of our flow object here. And essentially how Mantaflow works is first you bake your liquid simulation, and you'll see these kind of blue dots here. As you can see, when we play through our scene, you'll see them kind of interacting with whatever your effector objects are, which is kind of cool. And it's a little bit slow right now actually, so I might actually bring up the time scale to maybe 0.6. So there's a little bit more there, maybe even 0.7. Anyways, first you'll bake your liquid simulation. Then once you do that, you will bake your fluid mesh. And at that point, you can see your fluid in solid view, which you can't see right now because we haven't baked anything yet. when you bake your mesh, you can choose how much you want to up-res your mesh by, and then finally you'll bake your particles and whatever particles you want to add more detail to your simulation. So there are a few things you can change to get more or less detail in your simulation, and depending on the hardware in your computer, you may want to increase or decrease them. So the first thing we're going to bake is our just basic liquid simulation here. So I want to change our resolution divisions to something a little bit higher than 32. 32 is definitely not enough. I'd say 256 will get you a pretty realistic result, I'd say, with this small of a domain cube. However, for the sake of this tutorial, that's going to be pretty heavy on my hardware, so I might just use something like 150. But generally, the more resolution divisions, the better your simulation is going to look, and the more likely you'll be able to combine it with a live action shot seamlessly. So I'll put this at 150, maybe even 160 actually, and we'll go ahead and bake our fluid simulation. So under cache, I'll change the type to modular. And one more thing before we bake our simulation, while you're experimenting with different looks, it's nice to leave your type for the cache as replay, so you can actually play through your scene here and see how your water is interacting with your shot. So first I might decrease your resolution divisions to 32 like it was, and then just play around with how you want your simulation to look, so you can adjust all these different settings and get different looks for the particles you can see here in that replay mode for your cache data. And then when you finally get something that looks kind of generally what you want, we'll increase this back to say 160. Then I'll go back here to cache, change our type to modular, make it resumable so we can pause or continue our bake. And then finally, we'll click on bake data, and let's see what we get for our initial fluid simulation. All right guys, so as you can see here, we have baked our initial fluid simulation, and it's looking pretty cool here. As you can see, if I choose some different frames along our shot, you can get an idea of what we're looking at with these particles right here, which I think is going to be a pretty nice looking result. So now that we have baked our liquid simulation using the flip simulation method, we'll go down here to the mesh panel here and bake our fluid simulation mesh. So I'll go ahead and select this checkbox, and now we have a variety of settings we can choose from. You can up-res your simulation by as much as you'd like. I'm going to up-res this by 2, but again, depending on the hardware in your computer and how much detail you want in your simulation, you may want to bring this value up or down, but 2 should be good for the sake of this tutorial. I'm also going to check the use speed vectors checkbox here, so we can add some motion blur in post if we'd like. Go ahead and select that, and I'll leave most of these at their default, and go ahead and click on bake mesh and give your computer some time to bake your fluid simulation mesh. All right, so as you can see here, now we have baked our water simulation base mesh here, and this is kind of the general shape of our simulation. But as I mentioned before, if you need more resolution or if you want more detail in it, you can of course either increase the up-res factor in the baking of your mesh data, or back to the very first step, you could of course increase the resolution divisions in the liquid settings. But this is going to be pretty good for the sake of our tutorial. Now it's time to bake some particles on top of this liquid base mesh. So I'll just go here, scroll down here to the particles tab, and for this specific simulation we're going to be using the spray and foam particles. These spray particles exist kind of where high velocity parts of the liquid are splashing, for example. The foam particles exist kind of on the surface where there's some movement, and then the bubble particles are under the water itself. So I don't think I'm going to need the bubble particles for this specific simulation, since mostly we care about what's going on up here as well as the surface where the water is being disturbed. So I'm going to go ahead and select the spray and foam checkboxes here, and I'm going to leave all of these at their default for now. If you want a lot more particles, you can increase the up-res factor and you'll get more detail in your simulation, so keep that in mind. But for the sake of this tutorial, I'm going to leave it at 1, and that should be pretty good. So now I'll go ahead, and before we bake our particle system, I'm just going to save our project one more time just so we have it saved and ready to go in case we have any crashes. And then I'll just click on bake particles and let Blender go through our simulation and bake those particles on top of our simulation base mesh. All right guys, so we are back and we have baked our particles on top of our liquid simulation mesh here. And as you can see, this is going to add that next level of detail when we add some particles instance on these systems here. So right now, if we go to render view, we won't actually see any of these particles show up. So what we need to do is we need to go to the particle system tab here. And you'll notice that we have 3 different particle systems attached to our mesh here. And what we want to do is we want to create an object to instance on each of the particle systems here. So I'll start off with our spray particle system, and I'll turn off our other two particle systems in their viewport mode. And you can see that most of the particles in our scene are actually our spray particle systems. You can see that there's a little bit of foam if we turn this one on, just a tiny bit of foam on the surface. And then I think our liquid one doesn't even exist actually. Let's see. Yeah, our liquid is a little bit on top of our water here, but there's not too much of it. But anyways, I'll start off with our spray particle system here. And I'm just going to go to our render tab, and we're going to switch this to render as object. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to press Shift A. I'm going to add a very basic icosphere, and I'm going to click on this little icosphere setting here, and I'm going to bring down the subdivisions to 1, just so it's as low detail of an icosphere as possible, since we're just going to be instancing them as little spray particles. Obviously you can use any object of your choice, you can even use spheres, but for the sake of memory in your computer, it's often nice to use something of low geometry like this. So we have this icosphere now. Now I'll just go ahead and call it water particle, and now I'll just move it off to the side here, so we won't actually see it in our shot. Reselect our mesh, and then for the instance object for our spray particle system, I'll go ahead and select our water particle that we just created. And now, as you can see here, our icospheres are instance all over where our spray particles are in our simulation. And you can change a variety of settings here. You can change the scale of the icosphere, the scale randomness. I might increase the scale randomness a bit, just for a little bit of variation in the scale of our particles. So maybe 0.75. So there's a little bit more variation there. I think this is gonna look pretty good. I might increase the size of the scale a little bit to maybe 0.7 or 0.07. But yeah, this should be pretty good before our first test render. Now I'll do the same thing for our foam particle system here. So I'll select our foam. I'll go ahead and disable our spray viewport option just because it's slowing down our computer a little bit, but I'll turn on our foam particle system here. And then I'll do the same thing for this particle system. So for render as, I'll change this to object. And then for instance object, I'll scroll down here to water particle. And now you can see we have that icosphere wherever those foam particles would be. And I might just increase the scale randomness of this one to 0.5. And yeah, that should be pretty good. Now I'll do the same thing for our liquid particles. I'll turn off our foam in the viewport display. Then I'll turn on the liquid in the viewport display. I will select our liquid and then do the same thing here. So make it an object, then instance our water particle icosphere here. And then I'll increase the scale randomness a bit to maybe 0.5. And these liquid particles are pretty small here, so we might need to increase the scale a bit. But for the sake of this tutorial, I'm just going to leave it as is for now, and we're going to do a test render and then adjust from there. So I'll go ahead and turn off the liquid in our viewport display as well. And now we can move around our scene a bit easier since those particles aren't slowing down our simulation. And I'll go to our viewpoint camera. And as you can see, this is what we're getting so far. So right now, as you can see, if I go to render view, we don't actually have a proper material for our liquid. And we also need to add an HDRI and a background projection of our live action shot in order to get similar reflections on our water here. The first thing I'm going to do is add that environment. So I'll go to our world settings tab here. I'll change our color to environment, and then I'll open up an HDRI here of something similar to our live action shot. I don't actually have an HDRI of our live action shot, but I'll just use an HDR with some similar clouds and load that in here for some general cloud reflections. And we have some buildings here too, but that shouldn't matter too much as we're going to add that background projection to create some reflections from our live action shot. So I'll go ahead and go to our render properties tab here. I'll go to film, turn off the transparent option. And now as you can see here, our simulation is being lit by our HDRI. And I do want to change the render engine to cycles for some nicer rendering, but Eevee would also work as well, but I tend to work in cycles for live action shots. All right, so this should be pretty good. Now let's create our water material. And before we do this, I might bring down the strength of our HDRI so it's not quite as bright. So I might bring this down to like 0.6. That's looking a little bit nicer. All right, so now I'm going to go to the shading tab with our simulation mesh selected, and I'll go to render view here as well, then back to our viewpoint camera. And now we're going to add a new material for our water here. So I'll click on new, and I'll select this, our plane here that we were using as a reference for our ocean, and just turn it off for now in our viewport. Then reselect our mesh, and now let's kind of play around with our material output. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and delete our principled BSDF here that's here by default. Then I'll press Shift A. I'll add a glossy shader, and then press Shift A again, add a mix shader, and put this in the first socket of the mix shader. Then I'll press Shift A again, add a glass shader, add this to the second input, and connect this mix shader output to the surface of our material output. And you can see we have a semi-reflective surface here, and I want this to be mostly glossy, so I'll just dial that back down the mix shader factor here to 2. Then I also want this to be a little bit darker, so for the glossy I'll bring it down here like so, and I'll do the same thing for the glass, so it's just not so bright in our scene. And one more thing we want to do is actually delete our flow cube here. So we have our domain cube, and then we have our flow object that was creating the water within our simulation. So I'll go ahead and turn that off in our viewport as well as our camera render settings. So now we just have the liquid simulation part. Go ahead and reselect that liquid, and now we can kind of adjust the roughness. We bring it down to 0.2. We want a little bit of roughness, but not too much. And something like this should be okay for now. Let's go ahead and add that background projection of our live action shot, and then we can adjust this a little bit more specifically. So I'll go back to solid view here. All right, so now what we're going to do is we're going to add that background projection to reflect into our water material. So as you can see here, what I have is a screenshot from our video here. So what we're going to do is we're going to use images as planes to import this into our 3D scene and then place it in a way that creates reflections on our water. So I'll go ahead and close our window here and just go back to Blender, and I'll go to File, Import, Images as Planes, and then I'll go here to our desktop where I've saved our projection and import images as planes, and it's going to come in the middle of your 3D scene here, and I'll just scale it up a bit. And I'll go back to shading view, and if I go to render view really quick, you'll see that it's just an image projection of our background plate. And what we want to do is we want to rotate it around on the x-axis 180 degrees so it fits our camera a bit better. And then we're just going to place it behind our water so that it will create some reflections on it appropriately. So I'll scale it up quite a bit here, push it back into our scene, go to our camera perspective again, and then I'll just position it just like our 3D camera here, something like this. And now what we want to do is we want to make the material for this background plate an emission material so that it will actually emit the light of our image and not be lit by our HDRI, for example, like it is right now. So I'll go to our material settings here, and in addition to plugging our color input to our base color of this material, I'll also take it and plug it into the emission input here. And now as you can see here, it's emitting light and then reflecting off of our water here. And we also want this background projection to reflect off of our water but not be rendered in this specific view layer. So to do that, what I'll do is while it is selected, I'll go to our object properties, and then under visibility, I'll deselect the camera checkbox. And now it is indirectly affecting our water here, but it won't actually be rendered in our scene. All right, so finally what I want to do is just tweak the camera position here, and then I want to also adjust our water material to make sure that we're getting a little bit nicer reflection off of our water here. So this is just a matter of personal taste, so you may have to experiment with your own settings, but I'm just going to maybe bring down the roughness of our glossy a bit to get a little bit more reflectivity here. Now you can see we're getting the sky reflection onto our water here, which is a nice look. So I'm going to go with this for now, but I may adjust it later. So this should be pretty good. Now I'll go back to our layout mode, and I just want to make sure that our position is generally where we want the water to be. So I'm just going to kind of maybe rotate this, move it over here a bit. Also I'll have to move our background projection as well, maybe increase the scale of it. All right, something like this should be pretty good. Let's find a nice frame that we can do a little test render for. Maybe frame 27 where our whale is coming out of the water here. And let's go ahead and select our water simulation here. Go to our particle settings, make sure it's all being rendered. I'll check the spray really quick, so I'll turn that on. So that's what our spray is looking like. I might go a few frames more forward just so we can get a little bit more in our scene. And yeah, this should be pretty good. Now, one more thing before we do a test render and go into our compositing process is I want to make a holdout collection that will hide the water below the surface here. So to do that, I'll press Shift A, I'll add a plane, and I'll just scale it up here to encompass our entire camera. And I want to bring it down to say around here. And then what I want to do, I'm going to relabel it. I'm going to call it Ocean Holdout. And actually, instead of making this a holdout layer, I'm just going to call it Ocean Extension. And what I'll do instead is I will make this the same material as our water so that our water will just extend. Even though it won't be a fluid simulation, it will extend past our fluid simulation so that we can blend it into the shot a bit better with a mask. So to do that, I'll select first our simulation, go to our material tab. We've called this material Material 1 for our ocean. I'll just go ahead and relabel it. I'll call it Ocean Water. Then I'll select our plane that we've just added here, and then make this the ocean water material as well. And now as you can see here, if we go to rendered view, our ocean is sort of extended, which is a nice look. And we do get a little bit of an edge here, so I might bring that up a tiny bit. And something to keep in mind, if there are a lot more splashes that go kind of concave within your water simulation here and would go actually under where this plane that we created would be, you may need to cut out from this plane the portion where the fluid simulation is. So actually I might go ahead and do that. So I'll go back to our flow cube here, turn it back on, select it, bring it up here, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to use this flow cube as a Boolean modifier for our plane here. So I'll select our ocean extension plane, go to our modifier tab, add a Boolean modifier, and use the difference type on this object flow cube, and then apply it. Now I'll select our flow cube, turn it back off. Now, as you can see here, our ocean extension has a hole where our simulation will be, which is going to be perfect for blending everything together more seamlessly. And I might scale it down a tiny bit because we're getting a little bit of overlap there. But this is the general idea, and I think we're going to be pretty happy with this result. All right, so finally, let's do a quick test render and get into our compositing process. So I'll go to our output tab here. For our test render, I'll render this at, say, maybe 40 samples. Then I'll turn on advanced. I'll select the seed stopwatch for some noise variation. Scroll down here to film, make sure it's transparent. I do want to have a little bit of motion blur, so I'll select the motion blur checkbox. And for the shutter, I'll bring it down to, say, 0.2, maybe 0.25 for a little bit more. I'll go to our output properties tab here. We'll render at 1920 by 1080p resolution at 100%. Scroll down here, you can choose where to output your animation here, and choose your file format as well. I generally recommend using OpenEXR for visual effects, but PNG works a lot of the time as well. So I'm going to go ahead and leave it on PNG for now. And now I'll just go to render and render image, and we'll go into our compositor once this is finished with its render. Alright guys, so right off the bat, this is our test render, and as you can see with those particles renders, it's looking pretty nice. One thing I might do is go back to the 3D scene and change the material of the icosphere being instanced as our splash particle, but this is looking pretty good for now. Now let's go ahead and combine this on top of our live action shot and see what we can get with a little bit of compositing. So I'll go ahead and close our window here and go to our compositing tab. I will select the use nodes checkbox here, and now what I want to do is just add a basic viewer node. So I'll press Shift A, I'll add a viewer, add our image to the viewer, and I want to combine this on top of our live action footage. So we need to add our live action footage to the compositing setup here. So I'll press Shift A, add an input, we'll use a movie clip, and we'll choose our movie clip here. And now what I want to do is I want to use an alpha over node to overlay our render on top of our movie clip here. So I'll press Shift A, add a color, alpha over, add this image from our render layer to one of the alpha over inputs, and then I'll add the image from our movie clip to the other one, and then I'll connect this to our composite and our viewer node as well. And as you can see, our render is overlaid on top of our live action shot. However, we do need to do some masking because we don't actually want to show the ocean here in the foreground. So what we'll do is we'll create a new visual effects tab here for masking, and I'll open up our video file here, and I'm just going to kind of create a mask where we want to put our water simulation. So I'll go ahead and create a new mask here with this button, and I'll call it we'll call it water sim, and then I'll press Control click, and I'll just create a very basic mask where I want the water simulation to be. And I'm going to feather it a bit so I won't make it too big. I will press B, select all of our mask points here, and then I'll click on Scale Feather and increase it a bit. And I actually want to switch the direction of the feather, and I'll scale up the feather a bit. We'll go with something like this for now. We may adjust it later. I'll go back to the compositing tab, and then what we want to do is we want to use that mask data to tell what parts of this render layer to overlay on top of our live action shot. So to do that, I'll press Shift A, I'll add a converter, set alpha, and connect this right before our alpha over node. Then I'll press Shift A, I'll add an input mask, and I'll switch this to our water sim mask that we've just created, and then I'll add this to our alpha for our set alpha node. And now as you can see here, we have only that portion of the mask rendered and overlaid on top of our live action shot here. And it's not perfect yet, so we will go ahead and adjust our mask first. So I'll go back to our masking tab, and I'll select everything at first, just bring it over here. We do want to make the top points a bit taller, like so. Extend these a bit as well. And you may have to experiment with where your points are to kind of blend everything into your scene a bit better, but this is the general concept. You can adjust your mask, then go back to the compositing tab, and let's see what we get. One of the issues I'm finding here is our horizon for our water simulation is not matching with the horizon of our live action shot. So what we can do is we can reposition our render on top of our live action shot here. So I'll do that after our mask so we can keep the part of the render that we've masked out. So I'll just move this over here. I'll press Shift A, I'll add a distort transform, add this right before our alpha over node. And then I just want to bring down on the Y-axis our render in the shot. And you can see we're just bringing it down to match our horizon levels here. And already we're looking much closer here. See, that's looking pretty nice. We're having a little issue with our mask here. So I'll readjust that, bring down the scale feather on this part of the mask. So it's not feathering quite as much here. We obviously don't want the water to feather into our land, for example. Go back to compositing. All right, so this is not bad. I'll start color correcting our element as well here. So I'll color correct our element after all of our masking information. So after our transform node here. Actually, I'll do this before our set alpha. So do this right after our render layer input. So I'll go ahead and go to color. We'll do a color balance node, and we need to warm up our render here a little bit. So I'm just gonna kind of eyeball it here. Just warm it up slightly so it matches our water in our live action shot here a bit better. I think that's looking a little bit nicer. I'm just going to eyeball it for the sake of this tutorial, but this is kind of the general idea. One thing I might do in the future is try to get a little bit more ripples in the water itself. As you can see, if you look at to the right of our fisherman here, you can see some ripples in the live action water, and you can see a little bit of ripples in our simulated water as well, but I think adding a little bit more might help too. So this is not bad. One thing you're probably noticing is this seam where our fluid simulation water stops and our just kind of reflective plane starts. So I'm going to go back to layout mode and make sure that we get rid of that. So I'll just go to render view here, scale down our water plane here, just try to place it a little bit more effectively. Try to get it to actually merge a bit with our water. All right, there we go. That's looking pretty good. You can see no more seams there, which is exactly what we want. And before we do another render, I'm just gonna make sure everything is looking okay. Just gonna make sure there's nothing else I wanna do at the moment. One thing I might do is just add a little bit of contrast to our render. It's a little bit bright, I would say, in the shadows. So maybe add a RGB curves here, just kind of bring down the general levels of our shadows anyway. And make sure our highlights are bright enough to blend into our water here. So we don't wanna do too much, obviously. All right, looking pretty nice. And I also might add some color correction to our final output here. So I'll press Shift D while our color balance node is selected. Add this before our viewer and composite node here. And I might cool down our general render, something like that. Start playing around with the overall look. At this point, it's just a matter of color correcting and combining your render with your live action with color correction and blur. I might add a despeckle node here. So what we can do, I'll press Shift A, I'll add a filter. Yeah, I'll add a despeckle. See what this does for us. That takes away some of our speckling. Didn't do too much. Maybe denoise. Let's see here, denoise instead. So that's looking much nicer. So now we don't have to increase the samples quite as much. Obviously our seams are still a little bit much, but that's helping with our sampling to get an idea of what we're looking like. I think the main thing is I just need to feather everything a bit more, but this is the general concept. Let's see what happens when we feather this out a bit. And there we go, that feather is definitely helping to blend in our fluid simulation to our live action shot. I'll go back to our layout mode and kind of change the general material of our fluid particles here so they're not quite as bright, and do one more final render in composite for this tutorial. So I'll go back to layout mode here, go to our water particle and go to shading, our shading tab here, and let's find our water particle in our scene, just as icosphere. I'll add a new material for it and go to rendered view, delete our principled BSDF, press Shift A. I think I'll add a glossy shader as well as a glass shader, and then I'll add a mix shader to mix between them both and plug these in right here. Plug this into the surface input. Now we have a little reflective slash glass translucent material, and yeah, I think this should be pretty good. It's gonna give us a little more water-like feel. I'll also go to object and shade this one as smooth so it doesn't have those hard edges. But yeah, this is the general idea. Bring down the roughness maybe 2.3. But yeah, this is the general idea. Now I'll go back to our layout view and I'll save our project and do one more test render. So I'll go to render and render image, and let's see what we get. Alright guys, so this is our second render, and I'm going to go with this for the end of our tutorial, as I think it's looking pretty decent for the resolution in our simulation. Of course, there are a lot of things you could do to make this better and blend into your shot. I've mentioned a few of them, but I think the main one is just having higher resolution divisions on your actual fluid simulation, and other than that, just adjusting different areas of color correction, maybe rendering out some separate passes so you can control the whale, the water simulation, the particles on the water simulation on their own separate layer, compositing them all on top of each other. But as far as fluid simulation in Mantaflow, this is the general idea here, so I'm going to end here. As always, feel free to leave a comment if you have any questions or suggestions in the comment section below. Let us know what you'd like to see next on the channel, and I'll see you next time.